Lisa Ekman, author of Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites, joins us on this week's podcast of Bald, Blind, and Buddies.
Bald,
Blind,
and Buddies. Dr. Timmy C., you blind doctor, how are you, pal?
I'm good, man. It's 70 here, sunny. It started out cold, but man, it's nice out there.
This, I think October, pound for pound, dollar for dollar, is my favorite month of the year. Number one, because of the weather. It's got that kind of crispness in the air. You can leave your windows open when you sleep and such. Mm-hmm. But sports, I'm a sports fanatic, and sports is just at its height right now. Baseball, which I adore. Football, college football, the whole spiel. I find it to be just the best time of the year right now.
Did you say college? Do you mean minor league football associated with colleges? Is that what you mean now that they're getting paid? Okay.
That is correct.
Wanted to clarify.
And let me let you in a little other secret, There's another, I got a bridge in Brooklyn if you don't believe that one. Yeah. No, I just love all the sports that are available. I love all this time of the year. I love chili. I love, making soups and things of that nature. So it's great. But we're very lucky today, Timmy. I'll let you introduce this guest because she, I believe, had reached out to you, right, Tim?
Yeah. And so first I will say, everybody, we are on YouTube now. We got some of our old podcasts. If you want to get it in that platform, check it out. You want to speed us up? You never know. We are out there. But yes, I would like to welcome Lisa Ekman to the podcast. She is the author of Deprogramming Democrats. She started getting a degree in rhetoric from Northwestern, and then a degree, master's in social work. I'm going to have questions about that. And then a Juris Doctor, JD, from Georgetown, and then worked in the swamp, shall we say, and has come to a journey, and that journey has led her to our podcast. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your academic credentials are pretty shoddy. I'm not that impressed.
Sorry, I'll try to do better next time.
Yeah. You have I love interesting people, and I like the fact that you have a master's in social work. My sister-in-law does as well. What drove you to that after you studied rhetoric, if it were?
Well, I sort of had a very interesting path. I kind of struggled a little bit, to be honest, after I left school. With my undergraduate degree, my first job was working doing public relations for Ticketmaster, and which had a lot of great perks.
That's a very popular organization. Yeah. Everybody really likes it.
Just from their nicknames, Ticket Monster, and it gets worse from there. Yeah. And they deserve every bit of the vitriol that is thrown at them. Oh God, yeah. I mean, they basically, what they do is create monopoly contracts with venues, and then they strong arm and price gouge everybody. So and I as you might tell, I didn't have a great time there, and this was back in the early 90s, and they didn't pay me well and they treated me badly, and I just didn't feel like I fit in the corporate world, and I really decided I wanted to try to do something to help other people. And my parents, when I was a small child, ran a school that we also lived in on a farm to help troubled teens. It was sort of a very early diversion program. So for non-violent offenders, they could choose to come to the school, and instead of going to juvenile hall, to really try to get their life back on track. And so I saw at a very young age the difference that a dedicated individual could make to someone else's life. And so I decided I wanted to try to do that. And I had a couple of jobs. I grew up in the Chicago area, and that's where I was living after graduating Northwestern. And I had a couple of jobs working as a social worker in a number of different programs. And then I decided, I really want to get my master's because I want to help run a program. And then the first year of social work school, I had my placement at a family center. And I was counseling survivors of domestic violence, doing therapy with their children, as well as doing supervised visitation with perpetrators of domestic violence who were court ordered that in order to see their children, they had to have someone supervise those visits. And as you might guess, that's a pretty intense
I was going to
situation
say,
to be
yeah.
put in. And I found, I couldn't really balance my own mental health. I either had to really shut down and just feel nothing, or I was crying all the time. And I decided at that point, you know what? I think I want to make the jobs of social workers easier. I want to go to Washington, D.C., and I want to work on policy. And I got nominated for a program called the Presidential Management internship program. At the time, it's not the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. And it was a program created by Jimmy Carter to draw people with graduate level education into federal service. The dean of my school nominated me. And so I ended up going to Washington, D.C., and I originally wanted to do work with children. And I went there for a job fair and really couldn't arrange. There aren't that many jobs in the federal government itself that directly work with children, and I couldn't get a good interview. And I got a great interview with someone who turned out to be my mentor for many years in Washington, D.C., although I'm not sure, haven't talked to her in a while, I'm not sure what she would think of where I sit these days, to be honest. Uh, and ended up saying, well, if I can't help kids, who else can I help that really lacks in some ways a voice? And I decided to work with and on behalf of people with disabilities as a result. So that's sort of how the social work happened. I actually went to law school after that. While I was in DC, obviously I went to Georgetown, and I continued to do some work with federal contractors while I was in law school too. So.
Okay. I'll tell you, that here for you doing that. My wife's a nurse practitioner who deals at a children's hospital here in Philadelphia. I don't know if you know, but Philadelphia is generally considered to be sort of the children's center of the world because C. Everett Koop, the original, the Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, was tremendously religious, and he started what has now become Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, more affectionately CHOP. Sometimes I don't know how my wife does it, seeing people die and things like that, but I remember when I was interviewing at Notre Dame for the Big Brothers Big Sisters program, they said, is there anything you can't handle? And the one I said is I cannot handle abuse on children. So here for you doing God's work with those people. So it's a fabulous story. So Timmy, why don't you ask your first question?
It's interesting too, because social work tends to be one of the most left-leaning woke professions out there. Like I remember an interaction with a social worker. They told me, my job is to make students feel safe. And I was like, my job is to make students well. And it was very different how they approach things. So I find that fascinating. And then it sounds like this led you into advocacy and into the swamp. Tell us your swamp tales.
Sure, yeah, and I'll just
if you haven't figured out Timmy's politics yet, Lisa, it's pretty obvious by how he phrases his questions. Calling it the swamp, left-leaning, raging liberal.
She's called it swamp in other YouTube stuff. So I'm trying to borrow her vernacular, John.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying you put your politics on your sleeve. That's all.
It is literally a swamp. So let's just put that out there.
It is
built on a swamp. So, and I think that. It is fair to say that when people go to DC, they don't emerge the same person that they came, and we can get into that more. It does. It changes you. Yeah. I mean, power does corrupt people, and the pursuit of it also changes people. And yeah, social work. I mean, I was a very left-leaning person, but left-leaning in the way that people were back in the 90s, not in the way that people are today. And, I like to say that I didn't leave the Democratic Party, it left me, and that is what I hear a lot of people who are former Democrats say. And I do want to also say that, I consider myself now an independent. I'm going to vote for the people who I think are going to, the very first thing that I'm going to think is I'm a First Amendment absolutist, which includes free speech, but also assembly, religion, association, press. And so if there's someone who's going to protect those rights, and there's someone who isn't going to protect those rights, I'm 100% going to vote for the person who does, even if I disagree with them on a lot of other things, because I'm not going to agree with anyone on everything. So
Have you ever heard Mayor Koch? He was the mayor of New York, and he said, give me 12 items. If you agree with me on 9, vote for me. He said, if you agree with me on all 12, seek professional help. But I think that's a good way to look at it. But you're here on the First Amendment, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, I think, it's, I am an American patriot, and I know that that can be a dirty word these days, depending on who you're talking to, because obviously, America's not a perfect country, but we do have a First Amendment that is unique in the history of civilizations. And all of the rights that we have, in my opinion, flow from our right to speak freely. And because underpinning that is our right to think freely. And once we give that up, first of all, when a society gives that up, it never gets it back. And secondly, there's no way to be free if you aren't allowed to think and speak freely. And so, I think you have to make a choice. Are you a collectivist, or do you believe in individual freedom? And I believe in individual freedom, and that starts from my ability to speak freely. So, I got to DC, and I actually worked directly for a political appointee at the very tail end of the Clinton administration, at the Social Security Administration, doing disability policy there. And from there, I went and worked in the Senate for, you may remember him, and I was detailed from the Social Security Administration over there, a senator from Vermont named Jim Jeffords. I don't know.
Oh,
if you
yeah.
remember him.
Yeah. He was part of the singing quartet. Yeah.
He was, which, is a anecdote
very bipartisan too. Yeah.
Very bipartisan. It was a really different time on the Hill when I worked for him, but I also worked for him when he left the Republican Party in 2001 and gave control of the Senate to the Democrats over George W. Bush's proposed tax cuts, as well as funding for special education, which that's a whole very long story, but it was one of my most interesting Washington times, and I had just gotten there, and I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and was going to make a difference. And he was a very, very good man, and he really cared about his constituents, and he cared about promises that he made to not just his voters, but the voters of the country when he said things about legislation he was passing. And so I worked for him, and I also worked for Ted Kennedy when he was in the Senate a few years later. So I spent some time up on the Hill, and to the point that you were just raising, back then, Jim Jeffords was in the singing quartet. People from different parties would go out to dinner with one another, and they viewed each other as colleagues and often friends. And there was not sort of the partisan tribal vitriol that you see and you hear today. The Senate was a very unique institution in Washington back then. It really did still have some of those traditions. And I think in part because elections are only every 6 years, it allowed some freedom to negotiate before you were constantly in a fundraising and election cycle, like happens to people who are in the House of Representatives. With elections every 2 years, you're practically running all the time, and you're definitely fundraising all the time. So I really, had some great experiences, great meetings early on. When I was working there, because I do think that people were engaged in good faith efforts to come to compromises that they believed could benefit the American population and the citizens and legal residents of America. And slowly over time, that got eroded, and I watched it happen with a front row seat. And part of that is, I think, because the left, Democrats started to move further and further to the left and become more and more radicalized, is the best way that I can put it. And that there was no such thing as compromise. And if you didn't agree with them, and this is, I'm sort of speeding up the timeline here, this didn't happen that early on when I was there, but if you didn't agree with them, it didn't just mean you had a policy disagreement, it was a moral failing, and that you obviously didn't care about the people that you were supposed to care about. And we started to see, a change in the public discourse. We started to see the demonization of people who thought differently. And I started to believe that I that couldn't necessarily make a difference there anymore because of that. And I think you also started to see just the overwhelming influx of money into the political process that happened after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which also completely changed the way that people operated in Washington, D.C. So that's sort of a start. I don't know if you have questions so far. You want me to keep talking about my story?
I can totally hear what you're saying. There's this, I tend to believe people who disagree with me are often naive and good intentioned, right? But have some
anyone in particular, Tim?
Yeah, but have some different understanding about human frailty and weakness and how the world works sometimes, right? But I don't believe they're evil necessarily, right? And I think this notion that you've hit on that when you disagree, suddenly it's not just a disagreement about an issue. It's a moral failing, as you said. I think that is really so operative these days. It's amazing.
Well, and I think the other thing that has happened as well with that, especially too, and I want to say that I think there are problems on, people on the far ends of the left, far ends of the right, and in the middle. I speak to the left because that's where I lived my life and that's the experience I have. So I do want to, make it clear to you and the people listening that I don't think the people on the right are perfect. I don't think independents are perfect, but I'm just speaking to what I saw occur on the right or on the left, sorry. And I think along with that moral failing, there sort of developed this hierarchy of people you're supposed to care about. And those people start with anyone who has been quote unquote historically oppressed or is particularly vulnerable. And anybody who is not in those categories are not people that you're supposed to you're supposed to extend your compassion to, or you're supposed to put in the forefront of why you're making a policy or why you think someone should be helped or taken care of. And so you started to see that more and more, and you started to also see, I think, as I said, sort of a radicalization of the positions that people on the left were taking. And if you didn't agree in lockstep with them on these positions, then you would quickly be canceled or ostracized or called names that end in an ism or in a phobia or in any sort of name that they could come up with. And the tolerant, inclusive left, if it ever existed, ceased to exist.
When do you suppose that happened, Lisa, from your viewpoint? I'm listening to your shared experience, or to your lived experience, I should say, and I'm not finding anything that I can disagree with because you were there on the front lines experiencing it. I have referred to myself more than a few times as a napping liberal. I'm a classic liberal in the belief that, elections have consequences, voting, First Amendment, these types of things, women, equality, and so forth. I always say, sometimes I signed up for liberalism because I wanted my daughters to be able to vote. I didn't sign up so that, we could have women competing against men and so forth, and all these things that are now sort of part of the parlance. Do you particularly point to one particular thing? One of the things I always am fascinated by is you kind of see this spreading, this atomization of politics with the advent of Fox News. And I'm not saying that Fox News is responsible. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Correlation does not prove causation, but it has sort of heightened the enemy aspect. And then, of course, the left responded in kind. I mean, both have blood on their hands. Is there a particular event like that, or is there a particular moment that you think it happened? Was it Citizens United? What was it that triggered this sort of?
Yeah, I actually, I talk about this in the book Deprogramming Democrats, and I think there's a couple of things. And I actually would lay the beginning, I think it was a long evolution that happened, but I'd lay the fault of this at the feet of political correctness to begin with, to be honest. It so basically, back in like the 70s, it was you be you, I'll be me, and we can agree to disagree, and we have a big tent, and it was sort of that kind of attitude. And starting in the 80s and then picking up in the 90s, people started to try to police other people's language. And it didn't really mean that much. They would say, oh, that's not a nice word to use, and don't use that word. And then if you use that word, you might have someone say you're not being very nice, but there weren't consequences attached to your failure to comply with the political correctness police. But over time, that changed. And if you didn't use those words, then you could get canceled, you could get doxxed, you could get fired, you could lose your entire livelihood, your career. And so people stopped believing that you had a right to your own ideas, even if they disagreed with them, if they hurt someone else. And it evolved into even if they hurt someone else's feelings. Even if, and I have, as a free speech absolutist, I have a big problem with the idea that language itself can be violence.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we
You're
have
here.
gotten to the point where that is, I hear people on the left say that all the time. And even in the book, I quote, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I do think language can be extremely powerful, but I also think that the power often lies in the hearer, not in the speaker.
And the recipient, not the speaker.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I said that exact thing last week. So tell us about your book, by the way. Yeah. Plug your
yeah,
book. We're capitalists. We want to hear about your book.
Yeah, my book, the full title is Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites: How I Escaped the Progressive Cult. And what happened for me really was that, I had sort of been, as I mentioned earlier, started to become pretty disillusioned with working in DC and was starting to think about what am I going to do next. And I decided to retire March of 2020. And I had made that decision about 6 months before. And if you can think back to the timing, that was right after 2 weeks
That was
to
perfect
flatten the
timing.
curve.
Yeah.
It was. I got out of Dodge just in time, so to speak, before the fight happened. But I think what happened with the government response to COVID really, in some ways, shook me to my core. I had spent 20 years working with people at the Department of Health and Human Services, working at the NIH, other agencies within HHS, and I really could not believe some of the things that they were recommending and some of the things they were saying was quote unquote science. When I went to go look for the science, I couldn't find it anywhere. And then, if I go back a couple of years, I'll try to tell this quickly. But I lost both my parents in my dad in 2014 and my mom in 2016. And my mom, she was diagnosed while she was caring for my dad, who was very ill, with stage 4 of an extremely aggressive cancer. And she was given the Get Your Affairs in Order speech, and you have a few months to live. And she turned to me and she said, Lisa, you know this stuff, you work on this stuff. Is there anything I can do to help beat this, because I want to stay alive? So I did a lot of research. I found a couple of books I thought were amazing. One is called Beating Cancer with Nutrition. The other one is called Anti-Cancer: A New Way of Life. And we got her to a naturopath. She did traditional treatment. She had surgery, and then she also started a round of chemo, which was 6 chemo treatments. But we got her to a naturopath. We changed her entire diet. We changed every product she put in and on her body. We changed every product she cleaned her house with. We worked with visualization, guided meditation, breathing exercises, all sorts of things recommended in these books. And when she had a test done after 3 rounds of chemo, and she was cancer free. And her doctor was astounded, and she had 2 years where she was cancer free. And then a tiny growth appeared on a routine scan, and she had one more chemo treatment, and her kidneys shut down from the chemo. And so what I took away from this experience, was I learned a lot about what makes us sick, how we stay healthy, and it shook in some ways my unquestioning belief in the agencies that regulated the the drugs that are approved, how they're used, and our food supply, as well as uh, their recommendations about what we should eat, based on what I read in those two books, but also a lot of the other research that I did. I spent a lot of time on NIH's PubMed and read a lot of studies that confirmed a lot of the things that I read in those books. And so, but that the belief that had in those agencies, I kind of had to just keep believing, because I was going back to work with those same agencies again. And flash forward now from 2016 to 2020, and COVID, and I start seeing some of the recommendations that are coming out, and they just didn't compute. And one that I will share, because I think it's easy for a lot of people to understand, was the idea that we were not allowed to leave our houses, even if we had our own backyard. And that which just didn't make any sense, because one of the things I had learned both from these books, but also my additional research, was that getting sunshine to get natural vitamin D is just about the healthiest thing you can do for yourself. And as it turned out, there was a lot of studies later during COVID that showed that if, a lot of the people who were most affected negatively were people who are vitamin D deficient. And so the idea that they were ordering us to stay in our houses, not get sunshine, not breathe fresh air, because another thing is that most bacteria, viruses, cancer thrive in anaerobic environments. So the less oxygen you have, the more likely they are to thrive. Well, you're better off being outside getting fresh air than you are inside and getting recycled air. And so
Timmy and I each have kids. We know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Get
Well,
yourself outside.
and inside air tends to pass things between people too, just from a practical sense.
Yeah, exactly. So as all of this is happening, that is going on in the back of my mind. Like, what are they doing? And then the censorship started. Where some of the people I had started following after doing the research for my mom were getting censored, and anybody asking any question that might counter what the public health narrative that was being put forward by our public health agencies were being actively censored, and as we have found out since, by in cooperation with and at the behest of and under the threat of our government. So, my First Amendment alarm bells started going off, and it wasn't just the free speech. It was, we're having a public health emergency, and now you are no longer allowed to assemble where you want. You are no longer allowed to associate where you want, and you are no longer allowed to worship when and where you please. And so all of these things are alarm bells going off in my head. And at the same time, my boyfriend, who is now my partner, he and I were not seeing eye to eye, because at first I was really afraid, and I was buying everything they were saying about COVID and just going along with it. And then he wasn't. And so we were kind of arguing back and forth and arguing back and forth. And despite the fact that I was doing this research and saw them censoring and downplaying things like the Great Barrington Declaration, which was, tens of thousands of scientists and doctors and researchers arguing for a risk reduction approach that targeted the most vulnerable people most likely to be negative affected and not shutting down society, they were getting censored. Despite all of that, I just still couldn't believe that the people that I had worked with and the agencies that I had trusted for so long were doing this to us as Americans, but also doing this to the world without the data and evidence to back it up. And my boyfriend at the time, his name's Jamie, he said to me, "But Lisa, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do?" And I said, my brain doesn't really have an answer for that because, in the research that I did for my mom, I did find out, fluoride, which they have confirmed since that time, the government has, fluoride can have a significant negative impact on IQ for children, and fluoride can contribute to calcifying our pineal gland, and the chlorine in our water isn't exactly, it can have negative health effects. And then I started looking at water testing, and when you drink water in many municipal water systems, you are getting trace elements of your neighbor's prescription drugs because they don't adequately filter them out. So I
pick your neighbors carefully.
Exactly. Well,
I hope one of those neighbors is on Ozempic. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah, I'm wondering when they're going to put Ozempic in the water table, to be perfectly candid with you. Let's just speed this process up.
Right. And maybe they already have. Who knows?
Maybe.
So pick your neighbors carefully. Make sure you get it next to the ones who have the good drugs, not the bad drugs,
Right.
So, and so with that question, he sort of caused my brain to start thinking again. He caused me to allow myself to ask questions again. And I think one of the other things that I talk about in the book is that, I think our education system has turned into an indoctrination system with a very, very skewed to one side ideological
Can I give an anecdote?
viewpoint. Sure, please.
We went to back to school night and learned about the history curriculum, world history. And next semester, my sophomore son, they're going to put Columbus on trial for genocide and other crimes. And I was like, Paul, you're on the defense. you're standing up for Columbus. So yes,
you're voting to acquit.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and let me ask you something,
ahead.
Lisa. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, please.
All of your points are well received, and you're not going to hear an argument from me. And one of my most frustrating things is I always, Timmy hears me say this all the time. I signed up for liberalism so my daughters could have equal rights. I didn't sign up for all this crazy, crazy stuff. And again, COVID did nothing to help the argument. And it took me time, too. I married a nurse practitioner, and I've said this before, and I'm not picking on Timmy, but I always believed that if a doctor spoke, it was the word of God. But when Anthony Fauci engages in the noble lie, noble though it may be, it's still a lie. And when he told people you didn't need masks and all these other things, what I'm getting at, and I asked Timmy this because we had a discussion about COVID, is where is the proper line as you see it? Because you're not going to hear me disagree with anything. And the fact that, they were saying things that just weren't true. I'm wondering what the proper line is in a pandemic with free speech. That's the time where I said earlier, I'm a free speech absolutist, but for a few examples. When there's a pandemic, and again, let's just imagine COVID never happened. Well, when there's a pandemic, what is the proper role of free speech? Because I don't want people saying drink bleach. Do you know what I'm saying? I understand speech is speech. I will advocate for it to my dying breath. But what do you suppose, or do you have an argument as to where the proper line is in dealing with a global pandemic and free speech?
So I think I'm going to stick with my absolutism here because...
You are? Okay.
Yeah, I am. I will. The first thing I would say is there's no public health exception to the U.S. Constitution.
Fair enough.
And again, this is where I try to put it to people sometimes. You don't seem to have it, but
I do. Let me lay all my cards on the table.
Okay.
And I will be the first person to tell you, Obama's my guy. I love him. I understand. Okay. I completely understand how Trump got elected. That doesn't mean I'm happy about it. I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I find him to be unacceptable, both as a person, a human being, a politician, a president. But again, I understand why, given the choice that we had with Kamala Harris and he, or Hillary Clinton and he, people chose the devil we know as opposed to the one we don't. I get that. To that end, though, this has nothing to do with Trump. It really has to do with what is, and I respect that you're sticking with the free speech absolutism, because I tend to be that way, but you can't run into a crowded movie theater and yell fire. And my thing is in a public health crisis, I'm going to defer, but it turns out they lied to us. To your boyfriend Jamie's point, we were being deceived. So, maybe I'm talking myself into a circle here. What is the line as a...
Yeah,
you imply there is a line, John. I guess, John, you're implying there is a line, right? There may not be a line in this case. It's just speech. When nobody knows the truth, who's censoring, right?
Sure.
Well, and that's the thing, and I think that it gets back to, and the reason why I brought Trump up just, was to say that oftentimes what I say is, would you really want Trump being the one to be able to say to you what you can say and what you can't, and what's true and what is not?
Yeah.
And my thing is that, part of the challenge for me, like I said, I went straight to government sources to try to find the science to support what they were saying, and it's not there. And so me being able to say that is really vital. Maybe we wouldn't have had kids with we wouldn't have had to revise our developmental benchmarks for children if we didn't shut the schools down. Okay, if people would have been allowed to speak more freely, and if a free debate happened. And I think that's the challenge, is even in a public health emergency situation, I guess it comes down to for me that I have to trust people to make the right decision based on a full understanding of
Have you
facts.
been, as Seinfeld says, have you been to the Motor Vehicle Bureau lately? It's a leper colony down there. No, I agree with you. I'm not disputing that. But let me play a hypothesis, and how would you respond? Because I did this to Timmy. I am 100% on your side as it relates to that. We should have triaged the most vulnerable. Do you have comorbidities? Are you, over the age of 85? These kinds of things. It's clear even at the time they were arguing for it. It's clear in hindsight. Why are the kids staying home? My kids are bright. They are going to be fine. But the amount of damage, tangible damage we did to school-age kids is just appalling. To that end, however, play this theory out with me. What happens if they say kids can go back to school, and one kid, 6, 8, 10 years old, somewhere in the middle of America, Kansas, gets COVID and dies? Could you imagine the political blowback, whether it's Republican or Democrat, of that happening? I understand life happens like that, and you may not even be able to prove it. I'm just saying, in today's hyper-intensive environment of television and all these other things, it could just explode, could it not?
I think that there could be a lot of things. Yeah, I think that
you understand what I'm asking, right?
Yeah, the internet,
they did it politically
social
because it was
media
easy.
Environment is challenging, and here's one of the things I also found with a lot of people on the left. Sometimes it's really, really hard to have principles and stick by them.
There you go. Principles are only relevant when they're inconvenient. Yeah.
And that's when it's inconvenient. And my heart would break for the parents of that child, but I also would say my heart is broken for the parents of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children who can never get those years back, and were never at risk, at significant risk to begin with. And I think that's the other thing, is that there's always going to be some risk. And if you were really, really worried about it, keep your kid home.
I guess I'm curious. It sounds like COVID brought you to a set of contradictions, right? Things weren't quite making sense. And I'm going to do it, John. I'm going to quote Ayn Rand, who says, when you meet a contradiction, check your premises. So what premise did you have wrong that led you there? What was the false, the false belief or the inaccuracy that got you to that point?
So I think what had happened to me, in part through indoctrination, through all of my, very, mid-range education that I have, as John said.
No, I said your academic credentials aren't impressive at all.
There you go. My unimpressive academic credentials. Thank you. I couldn't remember. But, is that it gets drilled into your head that authority is always right. Don't question the teacher.
And I'm probably one of those. I'll be honest with you, Lisa.
Yeah, So I think that is really the premise, like believing that it makes sense that the FDA head rotates in and out of big pharma, and that that they're still gonna hold their former and future employer to account, and really have your health as their top priority. I think that was it. And when I said the full name of my book, how I escaped the progressive cult, it's really cult-like belief. It's worshiping authority and idolizing the expert in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the failure to question whether experts are always right.
Right. And in order to do that, you need to have free access to information and the opinion of various experts, right?
Exactly. And, one of the other things that our education system has done is it prioritizes one kind of intelligence. And then says if you have this kind of intelligence, you're the expert. And it kind of downplays things like anecdotes. It downplays emotional intelligence, creativity, a lot of, I would say, other kinds of intelligence. And it gets you, in many cases, I think, to sublimate your intuition, to sublimate your gut. When you feel like something in your gut says that's not right, but then in your brain it says, well, the expert told me it is, you're going to go with your brain instead of your gut. And often that intuition or that gut feeling may have been 100% correct.
And there's social consequences for me speaking up about my gut, right? It's not just the expert says, it's with political correctness and the follow-ons, right? There's consequences.
100%. And I think, I think that one of the things, there's a chapter in my book about what are the characteristics of the people on the left that made them more susceptible or to this type of indoctrination or brainwashing. And I think part of that is that, and this is not true for everyone on the left, I'm generalizing, and I think it may be more true for women on the left than it is for men.
Because, nice, again, we're getting sexism in here. This is good for ratings.
I'm happy to go there. I have a lot of opinions on that.
I'm enjoying the hell out of this discussion, though. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, people on the left tend to really, really need external validation for their sense of self and their self-worth. I think part of
Couldn't that be social media, not just the left?
Meaning, it is social media.
Of social media, everybody has to see me. Look at this ham and cheese I made. My kid won't sleep. Well, maybe because you're tapping away on the keyboard. Yeah.
It feeds it for sure.
I'm not. Two things can be true. You may very well be right that it's more susceptible, and I happen to agree with that statement.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if that's not true with just America in general, with social media, and we have a lot of first world problems in this country. So
we definitely do. I will say that one thing I think that makes the left a little bit more susceptible to it, at least in my experience, is a lack of faith. And I don't mean necessarily just a connection to organized religion, but a connection to the creator, an understanding that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And what that often gives you is a sense of self-worth that comes intrinsically and doesn't require the same level of external validation to get it. And in my experience, and I will say, I've spent a lot of time with people across the ideological spectrum since I woke up, and especially since I wrote the book, and I've been talking to people who believe all different sorts of things, from the mundane to the extremely wacky. And I do find that the connection to something bigger, and again, it often is in terms of a religious faith, but it often is not also, makes you not care as much about what other people think of you and not need that external validation quite as much.
Here.
And I think a big part of that, in a way that a lot of people, especially on the very progressive left, are controlled, is through fear. And, COVID's a perfect example. I mean, it was fear 24/7. Let me put this counter on your screen at all times of day, telling you how many people are infected, and let's isolate you and make you afraid. And fear is a very powerful motivator, and it shuts down critical thinking, and it activates the brainstem survival, reptilian survival brain, where all you think about is being made safe. And
Yeah.
at that point, you're willing to accept a lot of things that, if you were questioning things, asking questions, and critically thinking, you might reject. Um, and again, I think when you have some sort of faith in something bigger than yourself besides the government, uh, it makes it harder to control you with that fear.
Yeah.
Lisa, I have one last question, and then I'll pass it to Timmy, and then we're going to, of course, as per usual, this has been fascinating. There's not a single word that has come out of your mouth that I disagree with. You and I probably have differences in shading, meaning I'm still trying to wrestle with the appropriate government responsibility during a pandemic. What we didn't help the argument. How about that? But there is a woman, Navy pilot, running for governor of New Jersey. Her name is Mikey Sherrill. I don't know if you're familiar with her or if you're familiar with her work. She's likely to win the governorship, largely because whoever is in the White House, whether it's a Republican, the Democrat wins. If there's a Democrat in the White House, the Republican tends to win, as was the case with Chris Christie. There's an ad that is out, and I find it very effective. And her opponent is showing her at a speech about clean energy. And she said, look, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, but if you're a good person, you'll do it. And I thought to myself, that right there is a 10-second encapsulation of the failing of the Democratic Party. They're missing the lunch pail issues for these larger sort of you're a good person idea. What do you think of that? Do you think that's a fair assessment? Meaning, Obama, to his credit, and I'm an Obama guy, so I'm not the most rational, used to remind his staff, folks, it's about their paycheck and their job and their sense of self. And that's how he won. And I just think that the Democrats have gotten away from that over the last 15 plus years to more of identity, groupthink, these kinds of things. Is that a fair assessment? Is that commercial indicative, as you see it, of today's Democratic Party?
I think that it is. I think it is fair, and I think it is indicative, and I think it gets to the point. I think that the Democratic Party has lost their connection with the average person. They do not.
No doubt
They
about it.
they have gotten so elitist. They have gotten to the point where they think they know better than you. And I say they, and this was me. You know, you'll hear them
I
say,
vote
"Oh,
Democrat. That doesn't mean I am one. It's a chocolate or vanilla race. You got to pick, and I tend to vote Democratic. That doesn't mean I'm one. Believe me.
which
So
I understand. I bled blue. I would say, you used to say,
not
I
I.
vote blue no matter who. I did. I'm not
No.
saying you did. I did, but I think that the Democratic Party, and especially the leaders, have really lost any connection with what matters to the vast majority of voters. And I think the other thing that is is true, and like I said early on, is that there's this moral superiority, and there's this idea that if we disagree about any kind of policy, you're a bad person. You're morally inferior. And I think that having a policy disagreement doesn't mean that you don't both care about that individual. But it shouldn't be a moral failing to ask, have our welfare policies actually helped poor people?
Right.
Do we see an improvement when we look at our welfare policies and see that they discourage marriage and they encourage single parent families in order to get any help? And then we look at the data and see that one of the biggest predictors of whether someone can improve their socioeconomic status is whether they grow up in a two-parent household. And we could talk. I could talk to you for hours about whether I think that was on purpose and what it's done in particular to the Black community in America, and I think that it is. But if you even mention that you want to reform our welfare policies, you are now you're morally bad because you don't care about the people who get welfare.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's the way that it's framed. And then I think
and that was Clinton's big thing, the welfare to work. I mean, that was, he kind of triangulated, and he was successful, and I think Obama was as well. And I just, to your point earlier, and I'm sorry to steal your thunder, but I just think that the Democratic Party has lost its way with Joe the plumber. I say that he's since passed, but the person in Cleveland, Ohio, who works as a machinist that used to vote Democrat, and they just don't speak to them anymore. It's really, it's difficult to watch.
Well, I think it's because, in part, it is because when Clinton started our push towards globalization, they stopped actually protecting the working person.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole, that's a whole other story. But I think that the Democratic Party has lost its way, and the policies, I think I maybe mentioned this earlier on. At some point you kind of have to choose whether you're going to base your policies on individual liberties and individual rights, or you're going to base it on collectivism, and you can't have both. And I think the Democratic Party has gone too far to the collective space for a lot of people, and that it's hard to get back from.
So I guess I'm trying to weave this thread from this podcast, and then we'll ask you for your whack job or your hero if you have one as a final question. So I'm picturing your folks and the farm and the school. And, it sounds like, I don't know a lot, but that sounds like it was probably a labor of love and
Timmy, did you just say you don't know a lot?
Yeah,
let's run that on a loop.
Yeah. We'll clip. I'll clip that out. Don't worry.
Dozens and dozens
It won't make it won't make the edits. So
please leave it in, please.
so and I think it almost seems like, how do you scale up love or virtue, right? And the modern liberal answer is through rules and bureaucracy and telling people they're not virtuous if they don't comply. And I think this stems from a question: how do we scale up virtue? And religion and other ways provided ways to do this. And I feel like the Democrats with virtue signaling and that is struggling with that fundamental question. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And I don't think that you can ever mandate morality. I think, individuals have to want to make that choice. And again, this is where I was talking about the lack of connection to something bigger, that I think causes people to put their faith in government and to lose their faith in their fellow humans who don't believe exactly like they do. And it's very troubling in a lot of ways, because I think what we see now is the dehumanization of people who think differently than you, and that ends up leading to some of the political violence we've seen in the not distant past, in the recent past. And so I think that people, it'd be great if we could stop trying to force virtue through policy making and start trying to cultivate virtue in our communities, and leading by example, and leading, with love, because love and fear can't exist in your heart at the same time, at least in my opinion. And light and love, chase out darkness.
Have you ever heard the expression, Lisa, that every election is an opportunity to choose the contrast between hope and fear, and the mood that America's in is who they vote for?
I have. I'm not sure. Yeah, this last one. Ooh, that's a tough one to see in the last one, to be honest.
I think it was Vibes. Election. Wasn't Vibes one of them in the last election?
Yeah. Well, here's my problem with the last election. And Timmy knows this, and I'm on record as saying this. I despise Trump. Everything he represents, I despise what he's selling. I understand how he became president. He is my president. I'm not one of these people that, is going to deny that he was legitimately elected. He was. To that end, bringing in Seinfeld Kamala Harris to me is sort of like that Seinfeld episode where he says, at your first birthday party and at your last birthday party, everybody tells you who your friends are. These are your friends. You like these people, right? And that's kind of how I felt with the Democratic Party with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You like her, vote for her because she's not him. And that's just not enough to get people to vote for her. It clearly was not. So that was my disappointment as well. So.
Well, I completely understand that, and I think everything that happened around the Democratic side of the last election is a little strange, to say the least, and to have someone be the nominee who didn't receive a single vote to be the nominee. So, and someone who then, it's hard to make a case that in a very short time that you're going to do anything different than the last guy did when you were part of his administration. And so, what is it that the people are actually voting for?
So, yeah, I think that's a good place to, thank you for being on the podcast.
Lisa, this was absolutely, please be a repeat guest, if you will, when you write your next book. And let's bring on Jamie. Let's bring on Jamie, too, because I want to hear him about poisoning the water. So.
Well, this has been a really fun conversation, and there's so much more we could go into.
Oh, my God. We could.
So I'd be happy to come back, and I will tell you, I do not have a hero or I forgot what other word you used.
Whack job.
A whack job.
With all the litany of whack jobs in the Democratic Party, you don't have one that you just want to say, hey, you know what? Chuck Schumer's my whack job this week. Nobody?
Oh, as I told you, it's just too many. I can't think of who I would want to highlight at the moment. But Chuck Schumer's a good one with the shutdown. And yeah, it's a good one with the government shutdown.
There you go. There you go.
It's a clown car. You can fit them all in. It's so cool.
Lisa, please be a repeat guest. That was absolutely fascinating. If you have other people that you think we should talk to that are similar, because I am very much like you. Yeah, I'm very much like you. I'm struggling. Given the choice between two flavors of ice cream, I'm going to choose the Democrats right now, at least. That doesn't mean that if John McCain wasn't running against Obama, I would have voted for him in a heartbeat. But then, of course, he picked Sarah Palin. So again, my point being is I'm open to whomever, and I appreciate your principle that you vote for whomever, is going to protect the First Amendment through and through. Here. But again, I found this to be fascinating, and you really sort of germinated some thoughts in my head. So I want to say thank you personally.
Well, it was my pleasure, and I will, of course, I would be happy to come back. So just, reach out when you think it might be appropriate or you want to have another conversation. And, I think two things I'd leave you with is that I would leave everybody with. If you're trying to figure out what's going on in Washington, question everything and follow the money.
Good guidance. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Now I'm going to go have a cocktail Friday after hearing that. So,
all right. Yeah. Well, enjoy, and thank you again for having me on, and you have a great rest of your evening.
It was wonderful. Yeah. It was wonderful. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Take care. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wow. That was, it's funny because she was very clear that this is the team I was on, so I'm speaking about the team that I was on.
Yeah.
I think you could probably have analysis done of the Republican Party as well.
How did
the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan get Donald J. Trump?
Yeah.
But to that end, I did appreciate her candor, her honesty, and I the thing that I will take from that interview more than anything is her focus on principles and being a First Amendment absolutist. Mm-hmm. They only matter if and when they're inconvenient. And sometimes things have to give because of that. And I'm going to try and replicate that.
In a broader sense, I think the question is, what is most important for a society, right? And you can say, is it the absolute number of days lived by the maximum number of people? Or is there a measure of quality and freedom and things like that, which you also need to optimize? And I think that also, is part of your line in a pandemic.
Fair enough. So. Well, Timmy, have a wonderful weekend, pal. And this is John Boland signing off saying, hey, misbehave, drive fast, take chances.
And this is Tim saying, if everybody likes what you're doing, you're probably not doing anything worthwhile. Let's keep talking.